where we're going with this discussion. So today we're going to discuss actually the great debate of what is known today as Hay Teves. Today is the 5th day of Tevet in the Jewish calendar, and on the Chabad calendar, it's considered a significant date. Why is today a significant date? Because today Chabad, or the Rebbe, the Hasidim, won a fascinating court case. But it's somewhat of an unusual court case. It was a court case, a very big court case, that had a huge amount of money invested in this court case over a pile of books. That's what the court case was over. It was over a pile of books. Now, it's interesting, but most people would have thought that books are not worth fighting over, especially in the modern era. Why would we fight over books? It was about the ownership of books. So let me give you a bit of a background on that, and then I want to talk to you about why this is so significant and why it's so important. Why this became an important date in Chabad calendar. So the story is that the previous Rebbe, he was sentenced to the death penalty for being involved in illegal religious practice. And as a result of that, he was given death penalty. Eventually, he was sent to Siberia, was put in prisons, but miraculously, he managed, through the help of different personalities and connections within the United States, the Chabad Hasidim that were there, and pressure from the US government, the Frierdiker Rebbe was let out free in a miraculous way. Now, the one thing that the Frierdiker Rebbe did is he made it his job to collect every single old manuscript of books that he could possibly get his hand on. He had the original texts of almost every single Hasidic book, original writings from previous Rebbes, but also other books from all Jewish books. And as a result, he collected a huge pile of books of hundreds, listen to this, hundreds of thousands of books. The Chabad Central Library today is somewhat of 250,000 books. Now, when eventually he got away to come out of Russia, the Russian government didn't want to let him out. But when they let him out, they said he can go, but not his books. And he said, well, I'm not going without my books. And for him to stay longer was, to say the least, going to be a major risk to his life. But he was not willing to go without the books. Now, I'm not going to get into the halachic questions whether or not you're allowed to do such a thing. But it tells you, though, that he believed that his life was connected to those books. And with his stubbornness and his the way that he pushed his way through, eventually he was allowed to take those books with him. And then when he went to Warsaw, he went to Riga, he set up Chabad over there temporarily until the onset of the Second World War, where he managed to get his way over to the United States. And once again, he had this issue that he was able to travel, but not with his books. And he went through extreme efforts. He was not well, and it was extremely risky, but he went through extreme risks to save these books, these manuscripts. Okay, so fast forward some 50 or so years, and the previous Rebbe has already passed away quite a while ago. There's this library, there's a librarian that's paid full-time, known as Rabbi Lieberman. And what is found out eventually is that somebody has been stealing books from the from the Chabad library. It was known as the Chabad library. And these were all the books that had been collected by the previous Rebbe. And what is found out is that the previous Rebbe's grandson, whose name was Barry Gerari, he was, previous Rebbe had 3 daughters, the one daughter and her husband. Shana Hornstein passed away in the Holocaust, was killed by the Nazis. The other 2 daughters managed to escape. The first daughter escaped with the previous Rebbe, Chana, and her husband, Shmaryahu Gerari. He was the oldest son-in-law. Some people thought he would become the successor. And then the Rebbe and his wife came later on. Now, the Geraris had a son named Barry. And this son, it's understood that he thought that his father, being the oldest son, should become the next Rebbe. But unfortunately for him, or fortunately for us, the Hasidim believed that the Rebbe was the perfect fit for the job, and Rabbi Gerari was not. And he took that, and he was not happy about that. However, his father, who could have been supposedly could have been the Rebbe, became a devoted chassid and follower of the Rebbe, and he fully acknowledged that the Rebbe was definitely the person for the job and not him. But in the 80s, he says, well, there's this library. Some of the books over there were worth tens of thousands of dollars. We had books like the Baal Shem Tov Siddur. Could you imagine a Siddur from the Baal Shem Tov? It's not just old and original manuscripts, which are worth thousands of dollars, but sometimes they were owned by individuals like the Baal Shem Tov. And we knew that what he would do is he would go into the library, fill up a bag, and nobody suspected him as the previous Rebbe's grandchild. What can he be taking? And he would take out a bag of books and then he would sell it. And we know that he tried to sell to some Chabad people that bought old books, and none of them wanted to touch it. And that's the way that the Rebbe eventually found out about it. But he managed to sell it to other people that paid big money. He sold some books for $70,000 at the time. This is in the 80s. So just to explain the value of these books. And he had sold some 400 books around the world. But we believe that he was not able to sell any of the Hasidic texts because anybody who was a Hasid was not willing to touch those books. When the Rebbe found out about it, he was extremely upset, and he started talking about it publicly, and they tried to take this man to court as a Jewish court, and he refused to go to a regular Jewish court, and therefore the Rebbe suggested that they go to a secular court, and he was only willing to go to a secular court, and it was taken to the federal level in the US. Now, what was interesting, okay, fine, you have some books, you have some type of debate. What's the big deal? The thing was about it is that they knew that the whole time, this whole period from when the Rebbe found out about it, he was so distressed, like people had never seen him in such a distressed fashion. And not only that, he would go to the Ohel, the burial site of his father-in-law, the previous Rebbe, every single day during the court case and other times, far more often than he always did, and he always looked pale and someone not himself. All his Farbrengens, so many of the Farbrengens during that period, those few years of times, he would talk about these books. So I wanted just to pose to you, if anybody wants to try to give why do you think that the Rebbe took these books so seriously? Why was it so important to him, and why did it become almost like a central theme within his leadership? Why would you think that was so important?
Rabbi, I'd like to think that the money side was the least of all the considerations. Yeah, absolutely. I'm assuming that some of these books, they were the only copies left in existence.
Yes, this is true. So what you said is 100% correct. So the other side wanted it for the value of the money. The Rebbe was not at all interested in the money. As a matter of fact, they were willing to pay every single person back for the books, and to fund the money and to try to find the money to pay back for the books. So the money was really correct. The money was the least of the issue. But there was something much deeper over here. So there was two elements over here that I understand, as far as I understand. There was the very books itself and their worth as being one-of-a-kind books. They were very unique books, books that were not in print and were not able to be found. And by selling them off, those books would be lost forever. That's the one point. That's a very basic concept, which we understood was an issue. And we know that historically Jewish people valued books over everything else. And that's really the second major point. When you take the books out of a religion, out of a people, then they lose their identity. The identity of the Jewish people, to a certain degree, is based on those books. And these books were the very identity of what it means to be a Jew, of our whole history, of all our laws, of all the debates, of all the discussions that have been taking place by all the great people of the last generations till this very day. We're all within those books. So that book, those books, didn't just represent the books. They weren't just the value of the books per se, but more importantly, they're a representation of the whole of the Jewish people. There were books that would later on get, today, by the way, do you know that the biggest print publishers of Jewish books today, almost certainly, is Kahos. Kahos was originally set up as the publication society of Chabad, the publication organization of Chabad, by the Alter Rebbe, the founder of Chabad movement. He set up a publication, and today they're one of the biggest publications of Sfarim. And some of those Sfarim, most of the books, Sfarim is books, most of those books are Chabad books, because within just Chabad in the last 200 years, from our rabbis and teachers, we have hundreds or thousands of books. And today they all been broken up into more easier formats and things like that. So Kahos, but there's also lots of books that were not of Chabad literature that were published by Kahos, some things that were part of those manuscripts, those libraries that had not been published anywhere else, and the previous Rebbe I managed to get his hands on. But this was really what it boiled down to in this point is the books represented the very identity of the Jewish people, and particularly of Chabad. You see, this is one of the big mistakes that is made up about of Chabad, that we are a people that are of outgoing. We are the people that go out there and we kind of teach or bring people close to Judaism, and we're happy and we're dancers and we're... What people don't realize is that while all that is true, it all is based on a very broad, deep intellectual philosophy. And that deep intellectual philosophy is probably broader than any other group within, definitely in my opinion, and I apologize if I sound somewhat egotistic or biased. Obviously, I'm biased to Chabad, but I'm happy to have a discussion with anybody if they have disagreements. But I'm pretty certain that Chabad has produced and come up with more Jewish texts and novel Jewish texts and interpretations on Jewish texts, on previous Jewish texts, than any other group within the Jewish world. Why am I saying this? Because while on the outside we look like the people that like to do the big Hanukkah parties and possibly dancing and having the shul and putting in tefillin in people, and we see somewhat like it almost seems non-intellectual, but behind that is not just a deep philosophy, it's the deepest and broadest philosophy, and has been based on more ink has been spilled within the Jewish world the last 200 years on these ideas within the Chabad world than probably any other area of Jewish thought. Or simply put, our Rebbes, the Chabad Rebbes, have in general put out more books than any other Jewish leader Of course, there's individual Jewish leaders, but as a group of other Jewish sects, Hasidic groups, non-Hasidic sects, there was a very big emphasis on putting out teachings, on writing down teachings, putting out teachings, saying teachings, Maimorim, Sechot. That was the emphasis. It was very much, and that's why Chabad stands for Chachma Bin Dat, intellect. Where do you find that intellect? In the books. So by taking away the books, you were particularly taking away the heart of Chabad, the heart and the mind, the essence of what Chabad really is, which is found in the books. And in the books, you find the soul, right? The books are all there to connect us back to our soul. So this becomes a fundamental point. Now, there's a whole second element to this whole debate, what ultimately was debate, because what ends up happening is when you look at it, the Rebbe was, in my opinion, the greatest scholar of the generation. And he knew of every book. He had read all like any book that anybody ever quoted, he knew of it, he'd read it, he could remember it, he memorized it. So he really valued books and teachings. But there was something which was deeper. There was a greater debate over here, which was the actual continuation of the Chabad movement. So what I mean is that this particular individual said, the books belonged to my grandfather. And therefore, I'm the descendant of my grandfather. He had 2 children that survived, my mother and the Rebbe's wife. And therefore, half of whatever he owned comes to my family side. And my mother gives me permission to take the books. So half of those books belong to me. So basically what he's saying is, the previous Rebbe was my grandfather and I'm inheriting his stuff. Sounds fair. It's a nice claim. So what's wrong with that? The issue was that the Rebbe looked at the whole debate as being something much deeper. The previous Rebbe, we looked at it got to the very core of the debate was, what actually is a Rebbe? What is a Jewish leader? Is a Jewish leader a private individual that owns things, and therefore whatever they own, they give over to their children? Or is a Jewish leader somebody that is actually owned by their disciples and followers? And of course, there's things like their house and certain basic things about them that are owned by them and should be given to their children. But there's certainly their teachings and their writings. Who gets the what's it called, when you get the royalties, right? Who gets the royalties from all their books? Does it go back to their families? So a regular author, they write a book, they make a song, the royalties comes back to them. And if they passed on, where does it go to? It goes to their descendants. It seemed but here's the thing about a Jewish leader. If you say that a Jewish leader is just like a regular individual and whatever work they're doing, then they're really not a Jewish leader. They're really just an individual. And this boils down to how we define Moshe Rabbeinu, how we define Joshua, Abraham, King David. Were these people individuals that the royalties and the profits of their work goes to their children, or were they just actually a puppet of the people, so to speak? Not a puppet, but a servant of the people. Now, what the Rebbe was trying to show, he said, the previous Rebbe was not some private individual that whatever he owned went to his descendants. The previous Rebbe was a servant of the people. And therefore, any Jewish books ultimately don't belong to him. If he owned books, when he bought those books, he actually bought it for himself. Interestingly enough, in the previous Rebbe's will, he did actually write a will. And in the will, he writes that these books belong to the Chabad movement. He actually wrote it. And of course, there was debates and there was reasons that they had answers. The lawyers for the Barry side, or they said he was just writing it. He never meant actually that. He was just writing it because they gave. But the ultimate testimony that was used in proof, or that the judges went on for weeks. The judge said that one of the most binding and important pieces of information that ultimately made the Chabad movement win instead of this individual was the testimony of the Rebbe's wife. The Rebbe's wife, there's actually a video of this. The Rebbe's wife was questioned by the lawyers of both sides in her house for hours. And the Rebbe's wife, when she was asked, did the books belong to your father or to the Chabad movement, the Hasidim? And the Rebbe's wife said something which was quite incredible. And this is a line which defines true Jewish leadership. I talk about real leaders. She said, the books belonged to the Hasidim because my father belonged to the Hasidim. It seems like a small line, but it really ultimately defines the very definition of what a Jewish leader was. When you see Moshe Rabbeinu Moses, when the Jewish people sin with the golden calf, what does he say? He says, and God says, I'm going to destroy the Jewish people and I'll restart from you. What does Moshe say? Rather, I am not me. There's no Moshe Rabbeinu per se. I am the Jewish people. The Jewish people are me. Without the Jewish people, I cannot be me. And from that, the very definition, he defines, Moshe Rabbeinu, Moses defines for us what it means to be a true Jewish leader. The true Jewish leader is a Rebbe. The term Rebbe means Rosh B'nai Yisrael. The real Rebbe means the head of the Jewish people. He is the part and parcel of the Jewish people. He is what defines the Jewish people. And therefore, the Rebbe considered, by him saying that the books are his private possession, he was saying the previous Rebbe was a private individual. And therefore, he was also saying, and this was another step, that Chabad movement ended with the previous Rebbe. He didn't accept the Rebbe as the new leader of the of the Chabad movement. He said his father should have become it, and because my father never became it, therefore Chabad is finished with my grandfather. But so he was finding a twofold. He was finding what's the definition of a Jewish leader, and he was finding what's the definition of a Rebbe in general. Does the Rebbe own their teachings? Are they the owner of those teachings? Or do those teachings become the new lifeline and life force of the movement of the Jewish people? And ultimately, what the decision was, if you could imagine, here's the Rebbe's wife. The Rebbe's wife is a woman that sacrificed everything for her husband. She barely saw him. We know that he made sure to spend half an hour a day with her. And he had literally 22-hour days. But she was, when she says that my father wasn't owned by himself, but he was owned by the Chassidim, so to speak. He was there for the Chassidim. She was saying the very same thing about her husband. That her husband was not just some private individual. He ultimately was the individual that defined Chassidim. He was, so to speak, owned by the Chassidim. Of course, he makes the decisions. He has to make his own decisions, etc. So it's fascinating that I don't know if you'll have any other Jewish group or any other religious group that has a celebration of books, of a debate against books, and we celebrate. And today we say L'chaim, and we have a custom to go out and buy a Jewish book, Jewish custom, and all Chabad bookstores make big discounts. If you want to go Chai Books, you can get nice discounts there, at least 25% off on all books, because the Rebbe said, Judaism, we've always been known as the people of the book. And when people try to take books and make them as a monetary value, our teachings have a price on them that ultimately undermines the whole principle and the foundation of what everything Judaism stands for. I know that, Noah, you have a lot of love and cherishedness of books which you've given up to your children. I'm sure we all do, but I've seen it with you. So you certainly can appreciate that books are far more than what you see. They're the very essence. In Judaism, we look at our books as our lifeline. Our connection to God comes through the books. And that's why we've always been known as the people of the book. We've always made it a priority of us to teach books. I want to just finish with one final thing, which I didn't have time to get into today. I don't want to go too much over time. But there's one of the greatest debates that happened in Jewish history was in the year 1234. Maimonides, who's known as one of the greatest rabbis in Jewish history, his books were, in his day, he passed away in the year 1204. And when he passed away, he was born in 1135, and he passed away in 1204, and he writes several really important books. But in 1234, 30 years after his passing, there is a major debate around a book, one of the Maimonides books known as Moreh Nevuchim, the Guide to the Perplexed. And as a result, the people that opposed this book and somewhat opposed Maimonides, they slandered on the book and claimed that it had things that were anti-Christian in it. And as a result, the Christian leadership at the time in France ordered for the burning of all the books of Maimonides in the year 1234. Later on, they found out that it was false, and as a result, they actually cut out the tongues of the individuals that made this lie against Maimonides' books. But what was most telling is that one of the greatest and worst book burning happened a mere 8 years later, in the year 1244. They gathered all the Talmuds and they burnt them in front of the, what's that big church that went on fire a few years ago?
Notre Dame.
Notre Dame, thank you. Just want to confirm that's the name. In front of Notre Dame, they collected piles of hundreds, and in that time, it was before the printing press, books were handwritten on parchment. It was probably billions of dollars. You couldn't find a Talmud in the whole of that part of Europe as a result. So as soon as we start, and by the way, lots of other persecution occurred afterwards. It was the initial point of much persecution. But as soon as we start as individuals disrespecting our teachings and our books, unfortunately, that ripples down in a very, very severe way to other areas of Jewish life. So whether or not the 1234 burning is connected to the 1242 burning is something that we can debate. But most people would see that it happened so close together, and such two of the most significant book burnings ever to happen. And we know that the Second World War, Kristallnacht, started with burning of Jewish books. So everything starts from our books. And that's why today, the Rebbe, when you put all that into perspective and you realize what was at stake over here, it wasn't a library worth millions of dollars. It was the core and the heart of the Jewish soul, which is found in those books. And once you start burning books, unfortunately, you start burning people, because people and their teachings and their ideology are one and the same. And that's why today becomes a celebration, because when the secular courts acknowledge that our books and who we are lives on beyond who we are as a physical person, but has an eternal life and continues for all generations to come and doesn't become some person's private possessions. And Judaism has finally started to make a major difference. So I'll conclude with saying L'chaim. L'chaim, to life, because when we celebrate our teachings and our life, then we will have life. And it's a day of celebration. The Rebbe taught us a day of celebration because when we won the court case of our books, we got our soul back. L'chaim, l'chaim.
Chaim.
Hi, Rabbi.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for joining.
Interesting, Eitz Chaim. So books, I mean, a long time ago, they were made from parchment, but now, of course, made from paper, made from trees.
That's right. But it's interesting you say that. I didn't even think of that. When we raise the Torah, what do we say? Eitz Chaim hi lemachazikim bo. It's the tree of life for those that hold on to it. Our Torah, right? And our Torah is not just the parchment that we hold and raise. It's all of the teachings of the Torah, because the Torah just with the scroll is almost nothing in a sense. Of course, that's the holiest part of it, but it only has its value when you have all the other books around it. So it becomes Eitz Chaim here. The books are known as the tree of life. It's our tree of life and our continuation to who we are.
Beautiful. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Good to see you, Shelley.
Oh, thank you. I'm sorry I haven't been in for ages. I usually have a class at this time, but I was free today, so I went in. I'm so pleased I